Professor Laird here. This is Chapter 6 in the Political Ideologies class, Socialism and Communism after Marx. This will be Part 1. We're going to break this up into two parts as well. From the 1880s to around 1920, there was quite a bit of political and theoretical ferment in years after Marx's death in 1883. A lot of activity. We've already talked about the Industrial Revolution, how influential that was in America. A lot of things happening in Europe as well. There were several variations of Marxian socialism, not surprisingly, after Marx's death. The revisionists were one of the most prominent groups post-Marx. They preferred an evolutionary means of transition to these socialist type of systems, as opposed to a revolutionary. Talking a little bit more about Marx before his death, he did not necessarily see himself as a Marxist that was purveyor of this particular doctrine. He was a philosopher. He disagreed that his ideas could be reduced to a scientific theory or to a simplistic ism. Friedrich Engels was his partner for much of his writings. Early on, Friedrich Engels was a capitalist initially. He wrote The Condition of the English Working Class in 1845 that impressed Marx, and they got together, and he relied on Engels for financial assistance. Engels was somewhat of a benefactor for Marx while he wrote, also served as an inspiration and intellectual stimulation. Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, is generally considered to be Marx's ideas with Engels' prose. Now, the German Social Democratic Party was forming around this same time, most definitely influenced by Marx's writings. They were under a very charismatic individual by the name of Lassalle, who butted heads with Marx's internationalist view of socialism, that workers of the world should come together to make this system work, whereas from the German Social Democratic Party was that this was a national pursuit. So the party, after Lassalle's death, preferred the nationalist viewpoint of the Marxist socialist ideas. At the same time, not surprisingly, Engels then assumes the direction of what Marxian orthodoxy there is thereafter. But as you can see, we're already starting to get a lot of directions and alternatives here based on his initial ideas. So as far as Engels' ideas on Marxism, he considered it more of a scientific law of development of human history, again, building on Hegel's work of the progression of human history, then building on Marx's development of human history, the progression of it, while downplaying the so-called law of supply and demand as an artifact of capitalism, and that the laws governing nature and society are one and the same. As far as materialism, Marx defined materialism as humans in motion. Engels shifts this to matter in motion. So these are some subtle differences that were undertaken. Now, one of the most prominent of the revisionist socialists was Edward Bernstein. As well as the revisionists, we had some Fabian socialists as well that favored gradual reform. Again, the evolutionary path was more politically, morally preferable than the revolutionary path. They followed Immanuel Kant's ideas, Kant being one of the most influential philosophers from the very tail end of the Enlightenment period, followed Kant's ideas that one's will is free of outside influences. The revisionists were concerned about using any means necessary to justify end goals. So they were looking at it a more feasible, practical path to socialist platforms that a just society cannot be created by unjust means. They also had some doubts about Marx's predictions that I've already touched on a little bit before. There were certain things that Marx could not foresee, and many of his predictions have not held up. So here the revisionists are already starting to kind of look at that. Labor movements, voting rights that were getting more and more inclusive, the graduated tax system, the shorter work weeks. There was other things that were happening that were making it more palatable for workers, the progressive movements. And then looking at the state as an ally of the workers, as well as perhaps a guardian of the workers, when certain types of party policies were put into place that would help the workers. So that was some of the things that the revisionists were looking at as far as incremental progress being made. Also, contrary to Marx's prediction of a world of a few rich and many poor, what we're already starting to see as we start to get into the 20th century is that working class is better off on the whole in general. There was a lot of turmoil in the late 1800s, then the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era. A lot of reforms were happening at that time. Some success of the unions, as well as socialist-leaning parties, raising wages, improving conditions, overtime laws, child labor laws, and that workers were not necessarily a victim of false consciousness, particularly when you see that education in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, society was putting more value on education. But the revisionists were favorable toward a peaceful parliamentary path towards socialism. However, because of all the different potential paths out there and the differences, the infighting within results in a re-embracing of the revolutionists' side of socialism, of which Lenin will come out of that path. So speaking of that, looking at the Soviet Marxism by way of Lenin, as we get into the late 1800s, Russia is a large, economically and politically backward state with a majority of peasants, very undemocratic, an autocratic czar in charge. Much of the population was illiterate, religious, and quite unlikely to make a revolution in the sense that Marx had in mind, where they would have to be pretty self-aware to do that. Also during this period, with an autocratic system, political opponents were outlawed, not a whole lot of political options. So there was a plot to assassinate the Tsar, and that failed attempt resulted in 1887 the execution of one Alexander Ulyanov, who just happened to be the older brother of Vladimir Ulyanov, who is Lenin. So you could see that Lenin, from a very young age, had some payback perhaps on his mind for quite a while because of the execution of his older brother. So Lenin, as we've already mentioned, was focused on the revolutionary aspects of Marx, the class struggle, and that anything that helps accomplish a desired end is justifiable. So you can see that is veering away from the revisionists who felt like that we need just means to get to a just end. So he had contempt for Bernstein's evolutionary path or for Kant's ethics. So the Communist Party, which was forming at that time with Lenin very much a part of this, felt that it should be a fairly small, rather exclusive, quite disciplined, very much plotting and planning operation. The Bolsheviks, which is another word for majority of that party, the Bolsheviks under Lenin gained control. Lenin felt like the workers did not necessarily suffer from a false consciousness, but a trade union consciousness, which means that the workers were kind of lulled into accepting of the capitalist system through the unions, where they would get benefits through the unions, and that would keep them complacent, which is not what is needed for Lenin's idea of a revolutionary type of activity. So he needs revolutionary class consciousness. And they need to shift that into thinking themselves as a lower class or working class to justify this revolutionary action, as well as a vanguard party, the vanguard being just a generic term for a tutor or a guiding party to show them the way, which of course he would be the leader of that. He had a rather low opinion of working class mentality, and that democracy, where you would have a majority vote, perhaps along party lines, then everybody would just follow that. He did not feel that was feasible. The masses do not know their own real interests without someone to guide them, and that someone being he and his vanguard party. World War I did serve to ignite several things, particularly under Lenin's ideas that World War I was serving to advance capitalist interests, considering that it was eventually won by the Western capitalists for the most part, which would then exploit cheap labor, raw materials, and then pursue imperialism, of which the British Empire had been, in France, various Western powers had been undergoing for quite a while. The capitalists were therefore able to bribe workers, so to speak, with higher wages and union benefits, things such as that. So contrary to Marx's prediction that capitalism would fail, the proletarian revolution would have to be created in a poor backwards nation such as Russia. So this is the interesting twist or contrast from Marx's general theories, was that Marx predicted that once capitalism is in place, it would eventually waste itself or expend itself, then the worker revolution that would then come and take it over. Here, we're looking at a society that doesn't even really have a successful capitalism system in the first place. It's a poor backwards nation, so therefore Lenin is going to have to create it by forcing this revolution. The things that kind of precipitated the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, well, during World War I, the Tsar did commit to siding with the English and the French in World War I. The war was managed badly. Peasants suffered massive shortages during the war. Riots break out against the war. The Tsar does step down. However, the provisional government continues the war. This is a sore spot with Lenin. The Bolsheviks storm the palace and set up a workers', which is where the word Soviets come from, for workers, set up a workers' council. So the revolution is taking place. They seize the mills and the manufacturing. They confiscate land. Lenin, now in control, establishes what he calls a new economic policy, which is making this transition, but in the meantime allows peasants to farm the land. So he's trying to create breathing room in order to consolidate power, also as well as building a secret police force. So he already has it in mind that it's going to be under his control. Now, it's hard to predict what the Soviets would have been like under Lenin. Lenin died in 1924, and Stalin took over rather quickly, and there's really no question at all of what it turned out under Stalin. Earlier tips at the priesthood had taught Stalin the ideas of using simplification and ritualistic repetition for his leadership techniques. He was engaged in various bank robberies and other activities in order to finance the Social Democratic Labor Party in the early 1900s. Lenin was initially suspicious of Stalin's ruthlessness. Lenin dies in 1924, and Stalin immediately sets to work to get power, he eliminates all opposition and rivals. He then starts to suppress Lenin's writings and portrays himself as the natural heir to this Russian revolution, the Soviet system, and makes ample use of propaganda, trivial platitudes, playing on the ignorant population. Also, that ideology trumps science. That is a common theme throughout his rule, is that rules by ideology. Whatever science there is some junk science that he is advocating. One of the most dramatic disasters under Stalin was the unfounded predictions of crop yields. He was using some junk science of crop breeding. There was massive failures. As a result, led to famine. Not surprising, blaming this on scheming counter-revolutionary peasants rather than their own mistakes, where in the communist system, central planning is crucial. Now, the peasants, as we get into the 1930s, the peasants, working class, were forced to join state farms. This was a program of collectivization in order to finance the industrialization. So all the farms were put together as state-owned farms, and there was certain quotas that farmers had to meet. However, during the famine, the farmers could barely even make quotas. Nevertheless, the police were required to take all available food to meet the quotas. The people did not, it was also, they could not feed themselves until they had supplied their quotas. And at the same time, they were not allowed to leave their villages. They were prevented from escaping. So millions of people just flat out died on these farms here. Now, there was also some political motivations there, particularly biggest part of these deaths were in the Ukrainian region. And part of this was to crush Ukrainian nationalism. In fact, some of the justification for this afterward was that, yes, the state prevailed in getting their point across against any nationalist ideas uprising against the Stalin regime. So again, in that 5-year period or so, about 6 million people starved to death because of these decisions that were made. Stalin takes the vanguard party one step further. The vanguard party needs a single wise genius to guide it. Also, that socialism is consolidated in one country. It's as a permanent revolution, kind of counter to Marx's ideas of it being an international effort. This idea of historical inevitability, which is justifying everything that's being done, is that everything happens as it's supposed to, and therefore legitimizing the reign of Stalinism. His reign of terror ends in 1953, and when just a few short years after his death, he was denounced by his successor, Khrushchev. We're going to kind of jump ahead here because particularly we are in the Cold War from end of World War II up until about 1991. So the bulk of the Cold War was under regimes other than Stalin. In fact, Stalin was our ally, particularly in the World War II. May not have been able to win World War II without the Soviets' input there. The historical consensus is that the turning point of World War II was the Battle of Stalingrad, that Hitler was unable to get past that. It was an 8-month battle where 2 million people died in that battle, and it kind of stagnated Hitler at that time, considered to be a major turning point of the war back in the other direction. But again, we could talk a lot about the Cold War, but jumping ahead, as far as post-Soviet communism goes, USSR collapses in 1991. Not many people actually saw that coming, even though not necessarily a surprise when you consider for how long that they've been kind of struggling. The early gains were, like I said, with communism. You might see gains early on, but it was having very difficult time sustaining itself. And even under Gorbachev, transitions were already looked at as far as going to a more open type of democratic system and a more of a capitalist market economy. And this transition to the democratic capitalism was quite difficult, very unstable, somewhat volatile, economically difficult. When Putin took control in 1999, went back to the old school and had increasingly turned it into a single-party authoritarian system. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation only had 13% of the 2003 vote, 17% in 2012. Putin has been losing a little bit of popularity, but still generally a single-party authoritarian system. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation is promising a transition to a kind of a hybrid competitive capitalism that protects the poor. So that sounds somewhat like some of the social democratic platforms as well. So we are going to end part 1 here and pick up in the next lecture with the second half of chapter 6.